Imagine for a moment a world where the Mongol Empire didn't stop at Hungary, where Genghis Khan's unstoppable forces swept the whole of Europe, toppling kingdoms, conquering cities, and reshaping history as we know it. What kind of world would that be? What would Europe have looked like under Mongol rule? And how might that have changed the entire course of history? Now today we're going to dive into a fascinating scenario of what if Genghis Khan had conquered Europe. To understand this alternate history, let's revisit the real events. Now, the Mongol invasion of Europe was no mere fantasy. In the 13th century, Genghis Khan had already carved out the largest contiguous empire in history, stretching from China to Persia. After his death, his successors continued his legacy, expanding westward. By the 1240s, Mongol forces had already reached Eastern Europe, razing cities like Kiev, smashing through Polish defenses, and crushing a combined German-Polish army at the Battle of Legnica. Another European force was annihilated at the Battle of Mohács in Hungary in 1241. But then, just as Europe braced itself for total destruction, the Mongols abruptly withdrew. But why? It wasn't because they were defeated or outmatched, but quite the opposite. Europe was at their mercy. Their reason was political. Their Mongol ruler, Ogde Khan, had died, and Mongol generals were called back to the empire to elect a new Khan. This retreat saved Europe. But what if it didn't happen? What if Genghis Khan's successors had pressed forward with their invasion? The Europe of the 13th century was far from the unified continent that we know today. Instead, it was a patchwork of kingdoms, duchies, and feudal territories, most of which were constantly at war with each other. France, England, the Holy Roman Empire, the Italian city-states, and the Papal States, none of these powers had the military cohesion necessary to defend against a threat as organized and ruthless as the Mongols. European knights were formidable, yes, but they were also slow, heavily armored, and their armies were often more loyal to their local lords than to any central authority. In contrast, the Mongols were masters of speed and discipline. Their armies were made up of highly mobile cavalry units that could cover vast distances in a matter of days. Their tactics, like feigned retreats and ambushes, were designed to confuse and outmaneuver less flexible enemies. Had the Mongols continued their invasion, it's unlikely that Europe's fragmented forces could have mounted a unified defense in time. The Mongols had already shown their ability to take down far more formidable powers like the mighty Chinese Song dynasty and the Islamic Khwarezm Empire. European kingdoms would have likely fallen one by one, unable to coordinate in the face of Mongol onslaught. Now let's paint a picture of how this might have played out. The first targets would have been the largest, wealthiest cities of Europe, so Paris, London, and Rome. Imagine the Mongol hordes surrounding Paris, their swift horse archers circling the city, launching volley after volley of arrows at the defenders. Paris, like so many other cities before it, would have faced the brutal reality of Mongol siege warfare. The Mongols were not just conquerors, they were engineers of terror. Their reputation alone preceded them, often causing cities to surrender without a fight. For those cities that did resist, the consequences would be severe. If we look at the historic example of Baghdad, once a thriving center of culture and learning, we can see what might have happened. In 1258, the Mongols stormed Baghdad, destroying libraries, schools, and infrastructure, killing tens of thousands of civilians. Had Paris or Rome been subjected to the same fate, the cultural, political, and religious heart of Europe could have been irreparably damaged. One of the most decisive factors in a Mongol victory would have been their unmatched military tactics. Mongol warriors, born and raised on horseback, could shoot arrows with deadly accuracy while galloping at full speed. Their horses, small but resilient, could cover up to 100 miles in a day, far outpacing the slower and more heavily armored European knights. While European knights were used to engaging in close combat, often fighting in relatively small numbers in isolated battles, the Mongols operated in large, highly coordinated groups. They used psychological warfare as much as military strength, often massacring the inhabitants of one city to send a clear message to the next. This strategy, combined with their lightning-fast movements, would have shattered the morale of European defenders. Even if Europe's kingdoms had united their forces, they would have struggled to counter Mongol tactics. The Mongols were experts in feigned retreats, drawing their enemies into traps and ambushes. At the Battle of the Khalkha River in 1223, the Mongols lured a coalition of Rus and Kumen forces into a devastating trap, annihilating them. It's easy to imagine a similar fate befalling the knights of Europe, who were often overconfident with their own prowess. So what if the Mongols had succeeded in conquering Europe? Let's think about the cultural and religious implications. One of the key features of the Mongol Empire was its relative religious tolerance. In Asia, the Mongols ruled over a diverse population of Muslims, Christians, Buddhists, and others. They generally allowed local religions to continue, provided that the local rulers paid tribute and didn't challenge Mongol authority. In Europe, that would have meant a major shift in power in the Catholic Church. The papacy, which had a firm grip on political life in Europe, would likely have been forced to submit to Mongol authority. Rome might have continued as a religious center, but its political influence would have been diminished. The Mongols, having no strong allegiance to Christianity, may have even facilitated the spread of other religious ideas, like Buddhism or Islam, across Europe. What's more, the Mongol practice of moving skilled artisans, scholars, and engineers from one part of their empire to another could have led to a blending of Eastern and Western cultures on an unprecedented scale. Mongol rule could have introduced Europe to Chinese, Persian, and Central Asian technologies and ideas far earlier than what actually occurred. Imagine the Renaissance happening not in the 14th or 15th centuries, but as early as the 13th century, spurred on by this new exchange of knowledge. Economically, the Mongols were not just conquerors, but they also were facilitators of trade. Their control over the Silk Road brought a period of unprecedented peace and prosperity to the trade routes between the East and the West. If the Mongols had extended their empire into Europe, it's likely that Europe would have been more fully integrated into this global trade network much earlier. Goods, technologies, and ideas would have flowed more freely between Europe and Asia, leading to an economic growth and perhaps an earlier end to the feudal system. Now, the Mongols might have also imposed their own system of tribute on Europe, as they did in the Rus territories. Instead of independent kingdoms, Europe would have become a patchwork of vassal states, paying tribute to the Great Khan. While the local rulers may have retained some autonomy, their allegiance still would have had to shift to the Mongol court, fundamentally changing the political landscape. A Mongol conquest of Europe might also have hastened the decline of feudalism. Under the Mongols, power was often more centralized, with authority stemming directly from the Great Khan. In China and Persia, the Mongols reorganized land ownership and taxation systems to fit their own needs. Europe's feudal lords, who relied on local power structures, might have found themselves outmaneuvered by Mongol governors or administrators. Peasants and serfs, who were the backbone of feudal economies, could have experienced a very different kind of rule. Mongol governance was often harsh but very efficient, and their demand for taxes and tribute may have shifted the dynamics of European rural life, pushing economics to become more productive and centralized under Mongol oversight. One of the biggest questions in this alternate history is, what would have happened to the Catholic Church? In many ways, the Church was the glue that held Europe together during the Middle Ages. It was more than just a religious institution, though. It was a political power in its own right. But under Mongol rule, the Church's influence would have been deeply curtailed. The Pope, likely fleeing to safer territories, would have been reduced to a symbolic figure. It's possible that the Mongols, known for their pragmatic approach to ruling diverse populations, might have allowed the Church to continue as a religious institution but stripped it of its political power. Alternatively, Mongol leaders may have invited other religious leaders, like Islamic clerics or Buddhist monks, to take prominent roles in shaping the spiritual life of Europe. If Genghis Khan's empire had conquered Europe, its legacy would have been profound and long-lasting. Europe, integrated into the Mongol Empire, might have become a cultural and economic hub within the vast Eurasian realm. The Mongol administrative system, with its emphasis on communication, trade, and tribute, could have reshaped Europe's political institutions. Furthermore, the Mongol Empire's influence on European warfare would have been significant. The heavy cavalry and fortified castles of medieval Europe would have likely been replaced or supplemented by lighter, faster cavalry tactics of the Mongols. The very image of the European knight might have been supplanted by the swift Mongol horse archer. Finally, we have to consider the global implications. A Mongol-controlled Europe would have changed the course of global history. The Mongol Empire, already the largest in history, would have been nearly unstoppable with control of both Asia and Europe. This could have delayed or altered the rise of the Ottoman Empire, and perhaps even the later dominance of European colonial powers like Spain, Portugal, and Britain. It's possible that Europe's age of exploration, which began in the late 15th century, may never have occurred. Why venture across the seas when the riches of Asia were already flowing directly into Europe through Mongol trade routes? In the end, this alternate history, where Genghis Khan's descendants completed their conquest of Europe, paints a world very different from our own. It's a world where Mongol law, Mongol trade, and Mongol culture would have reshaped the very foundation of European civilization. The Europe we know today would almost be unrecognizable. So what do you think? How would the world be different if Genghis Khan had conquered Europe? Let us know in the comments below, and hey, don't forget to subscribe for more thought-provoking historical explorations.